A boy saves the life of a powerful, wealthy woman when she collapses in the park, but when she meets him again to thank him, he asks for something that shatters her world. He doesn't want money, fame, or anything you'd expect. Instead, his innocent request opens a door to a past she's tried to forget and forces her to question everything about her life. What could a boy with so little possibly ask for that would break the heart of someone who seems to have everything? And as their lives intertwine, will it lead to redemption or a devastating confrontation? The answer will leave you speechless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn breeze rustled through Central Park, scattering golden leaves across the winding paths. Margaret Pierce strode purposefully along the walkway, her designer heels clicking against the pavement. Her perfectly tailored charcoal suit and sleek black briefcase marked her as someone important, someone who didn't have time to waste. "I don't care what it takes," she snapped into her phone, her free hand cutting through the air in sharp gestures. "Those contracts need to be signed by tomorrow morning, or we lose the entire deal." Her voice carried the weight of countless boardroom victories and late-night negotiations. Caught up in her heated conversation, Margaret didn't notice the way her vision began to blur at the edges. The park's peaceful scenery, the rustic benches, the calm pond where ducks floated lazily, the children playing nearby all seemed to spin around her. "I expect results, not excuses." The words died in her throat as a wave of dizziness crashed over her. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the path. Margaret reached out blindly, trying to steady herself, but her legs gave way beneath her. The last thing she saw was the cloudy sky above before everything went dark. 6-year-old Oliver had been sitting on a nearby bench, watching the ducks with fascination while his mother tied his little sister's shoelaces. His bright blue backpack, decorated with rocket ships and stars, sat beside him. When he heard the thud of Margaret falling, his head snapped toward the sound. "Mommy, that lady fell down." Oliver jumped to his feet, his heart racing with worry. Without hesitation, he ran to Margaret's side, his sneakers squeaking on the pavement. Margaret lay motionless on the ground, her breathing shallow. Oliver knelt beside her, his small face pinched with concern. "It's okay, lady," he said softly, patting her hand. "I'm gonna get help." He looked around frantically until he spotted Margaret's dropped phone. With trembling fingers, he picked it up and dialed 911, just like his mother had taught him. "911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice came through clearly. "A lady fell down in the park," Oliver said, his voice steady despite his fear. "She's not moving, but she's breathing. We're by the duck pond in Central Park." Other people began gathering around, murmuring with concern. Oliver's mother joined him, checking Margaret's pulse while Oliver held onto Margaret's hand. "The ambulance is coming," Oliver told Margaret even though she couldn't hear him. "Don't be scared, I'll stay right here with you." The wail of sirens grew closer, and soon paramedics rushed onto the scene. They worked quickly, checking Margaret's vitals and preparing her for transport. Oliver watched with wide eyes, never letting go of Margaret's hand until they needed to lift her onto the stretcher. Hours later, Margaret's eyes fluttered open in a sterile hospital room. The steady beep of monitors filled the air as a nurse with kind eyes checked her vital signs. What happened?" Margaret's voice was rough, her throat dry. "You had a severe hypoglycemic episode, Ms. Pierce," the nurse explained, adjusting Margaret's IV. "You collapsed in the park. You're very lucky that little boy was there. Oliver. He called 911 right away and stayed with you until help arrived." Margaret blinked, trying to process this information. "A little boy?" "Yes, couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Such a brave little thing. Held your hand the whole time, telling you everything would be okay." The nurse smiled warmly. "He even gave the paramedics his own juice box because he thought your blood sugar might be low." Something shifted in Margaret's chest, an unfamiliar warmth that made her throat tight. Is he still here?" "No." "He and his mother waited for quite a while, but they had to leave for dinner. They left their contact information, though, in case you wanted to thank him." Margaret nodded slowly, her perfectly manicured fingers twisting in the hospital blanket. For the first time in years, she felt something crack in her carefully constructed wall of indifference. A small fissure, letting in a ray of light. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like to meet him." Margaret's sleek black Mercedes looked out of place on the modest street lined with small, well-kept homes. She double-checked the address on her phone, then gathered the gift-wrapped package from the passenger seat. Her heels clicked against the concrete as she approached the small blue house with white trim and carefully tended flower boxes. Before she could knock, the door flew open, and Oliver's beaming face greeted her. "You came!" he exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. "Mom, Miss Pierce is here." Lila appeared behind her son, wearing a simple but neat dress, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her smile was polite but reserved. "Please, come in, Ms. Pierce," she said, gently pulling Oliver back to make room. "Oliver's been watching out the window for the past hour." Margaret stepped into the small living room, taking in the worn but clean furniture, the carefully arranged family photos, and the collection of Oliver's science fair ribbons proudly displayed on one wall. Everything spoke of a home where love made up for what money couldn't buy. "I wanted to thank you both properly," Margaret said. Her usual commanding tone softened. She held out the wrapped package to Oliver. "This is for you, young man." Oliver's eyes widened as he looked to his mother for permission. At Lila's nod, he carefully unwrapped the gift to reveal a deluxe science kit. "Wow," he gasped, hugging the box to his chest. "Thank you, Ms. Pierce." "Oliver," Lila reminded gently, "what do we say about expensive gifts?" The boy's face fell slightly. "We can't accept anything too costly because we take care of ourselves," he recited, though his fingers tightened on the box. Margaret quickly intervened. "Please, it's the least I can do. Your son saved my life, Ms. Thompson," Lila corrected firmly. "And Oliver did what any decent person would do. We don't expect payment for basic human kindness." The tension in the room was palpable, but Oliver seemed oblivious to it. He was studying the science kit's box with intense concentration before suddenly looking up with bright eyes. "Ms. Pierce, are you married?" "Oliver!" Lila exclaimed, mortified. "No," Margaret answered, surprised by the direct question. "I'm not." "Do you have any kids?" "Oliver, that's enough personal questions," Lila said firmly. But Oliver pressed on, his voice growing softer, more hesitant. "It's just, family day is coming up at school next week. All the other kids have their dads coming, or uncles or grandpas." He scuffed his shoe against the carpet. "Would you maybe want to come with me, since you're not busy with your own family?" The room fell silent. Margaret felt her chest tighten at the raw hope in the boy's voice. She glanced at Lila, whose face had become a careful mask, though her hands were clasped tightly together. "Oliver, Ms. Pierce is a very busy woman," Lila began gently. "What day is it?" Margaret found herself asking, surprising even herself. "Next Thursday at 2 o'clock, Oliver replied quickly, hope blooming on his face. "We're doing science demonstrations, and I built a really cool robot that can sort different colored marbles." Margaret looked between Oliver's hopeful expression and Lila's guarded one. Everything in her carefully ordered life told her to make an excuse, to maintain professional distance. But something about Oliver's earnest request broke through her usual defenses. "I would be honored to attend," she heard herself say. Oliver let out a whoop of joy while Lila's expression remained carefully neutral. "That's very kind of you, Ms. Pierce," she said quietly. "But please don't feel obligated." "It's not an obligation," Margaret replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Margaret stood at the entrance of Lincoln Elementary, feeling oddly nervous in her tailored navy suit and Italian leather heels. Children and adults streamed past her into the brick building decorated with colorful welcome banners. She checked her watch. Exactly 1:45 p.m. Always early, even for this. "Ms. Pierce, you really came." Oliver's voice cut through her thoughts. He ran toward her, wearing khaki pants and a button-up shirt that had clearly been carefully pressed. Lila followed behind him, carrying a covered dish. her expression a mix of gratitude and wariness. "Of course I did," Margaret replied, managing a small smile. "I keep my promises." As they walked through the hallway lined with artwork and science projects, Margaret noticed the stares and whispers. A group of well-dressed mothers huddled together, eyeing her designer handbag and suit. Their children, wearing expensive clothes of their own, watched with undisguised curiosity. "That's Oliver Thompson's guest," one boy whispered loudly to another. "My mom says they live in that tiny house on Cedar Street." Oliver's steps faltered slightly, but he kept his chin up. "Our classroom is right here," he said brightly, leading Margaret inside. "I set up my robot on the blue table." The classroom buzzed with activity. Parents and children gathered around various science displays while a young teacher tried to organize everyone. Margaret noticed the sharp contrast between the families. Some children wore designer clothes like the ones in the hallway, while others wore clearly second-hand outfits. Oliver proudly showed Margaret his robot, built from recycled parts and carefully painted. "See? When you put the marbles in here, it sorts them by color," he demonstrated, and Margaret found herself genuinely impressed by the ingenuity. "That's quite clever," she said. "How did you figure out the sorting mechanism?" Before Oliver could answer, two boys from the hallway approached. "Is that made from old tin cans?" one asked with a smirk. "My dad bought me a real robotics kit from Silicon Valley." "At least mine works," Oliver replied quietly, but Margaret saw the hurt in his eyes. "Yeah, but everything you have is secondhand," the other boy chimed in. "Even your family day guest isn't really family." Margaret felt something shift inside her as she watched Oliver's shoulders slump slightly. She remembered similar moments from her own childhood, the sting of being judged, the shame of not having what others had. She'd spent decades building walls to protect herself from those feelings, accumulating wealth and status as armor. But looking at Oliver now, still standing proud despite the taunts, she felt those walls beginning to crack. "Actually," Margaret heard herself say, her business voice cutting through the chatter, "Oliver's robot shows remarkable innovation. Creating something from scratch takes far more skill than following a pre-made kit's instructions." She looked directly at the boys. "Perhaps you'd like him to explain the engineering principles involved?" The boys shuffled away and Oliver beamed up at Margaret. Across the room, Lila watched the interaction, her expression softening slightly. "Thanks, Ms. Pierce," Oliver whispered. "Sometimes they say mean stuff, but Mom says it doesn't matter what we have. It matters what we do with it." Margaret felt an unfamiliar tightness in her throat. She looked around the classroom, at the mix of families, at the proud displays of creativity, at Oliver's recycled robot that worked perfectly despite its humble origins. For the first time in years, she felt the carefully constructed walls of her life shake at their foundation. Margaret lingered in the school hallway after Family Day, gathering her thoughts. The afternoon had left her feeling oddly unsettled. As she walked toward the exit, voices drifted from the teacher's lounge, catching her attention. "Oliver Thompson is one of our brightest students," a female voice said. "His science project today was remarkable. Did you see how he engineered that sorting mechanism?" "Amazing creativity," another teacher agreed. Mrs. Chen from the middle school STEM program mentioned he'd be perfect for their advanced classes next year. But with the program fees and equipment costs... "I know," the first voice sighed. "Lila works so hard but on a single income. Oliver told me he wants to be an inventor, but without access to proper resources." Margaret stood frozen, her hand clutching her designer handbag. The conversation transported her back to her own childhood, to massive empty houses filled with every advantage money could buy, but devoid of warmth or encouragement. Her parents had pushed her toward success, not passion. They'd given her everything except what she'd truly needed. She thought of Oliver's face lighting up as he explained his robot, of his determined smile even as those boys mocked him. Here was a child with real talent and drive, but lacking the opportunities she'd taken for granted. Walking to her car, Margaret pulled out her phone and called her lawyer. "James, I need you to set something up. A scholarship fund, anonymous, for STEM education." "Another tax write-off?" James asked. "No," Margaret replied firmly. "This is different. I want to establish a foundation that will cover educational expenses for promising students who can't afford advanced programs, starting with Lincoln Elementary. She detailed her requirements. The scholarship would cover program fees, equipment, and materials for qualified students interested in science and engineering. The selection process would be handled entirely by school staff, with no connection to her name. Make sure Oliver Thompson is among the first recipients, she added, but it has to appear completely merit-based. His mother can't know it's targeted assistance. This is unusually specific for you, Margaret, James noted. What brought this on? Margaret watched a young mother hurry past her car, holding her child's hand. Let's just say I'm seeing things differently lately. Over the next week, Margaret threw herself into the project with the same intensity she usually reserved for corporate takeovers. She researched similar programs, consulted with educational experts, and structured the foundation to ensure its longevity. Each night, she found herself thinking about Oliver's recycled robot, about the innovation that emerged from necessity. When the paperwork was finally complete, Margaret sat in her home office, staring at the signed documents. The Margaret Pierce she'd been a month ago would never have considered such a project. That Margaret had believed in earning everything independently, in the cold comfort of self-reliance. But Oliver's simple kindness had cracked something open inside her. She remembered how he'd stayed with her in the park, his small hand holding hers, telling her everything would be okay. He'd given freely, expecting nothing in return. Perhaps it was time she learned to do the same. She thought of Lila's fierce pride, her determination to provide for her son without handouts. This way, Oliver would earn his opportunity through merit, while Lila's dignity remained intact. The scholarship would open doors, but Oliver's talent and hard work would carry him through them. Margaret placed the documents in her outbox, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, her wealth felt like more than just a measure of success. It felt like a tool for creating real change. The Science Museum's grand entrance loomed before them, its glass doors reflecting the morning sunlight. Oliver bounced on his toes, his small hand gripping Margaret's as they waited for Lila to park the car. "Did you know they have a real robot here?" Oliver's eyes sparkled with excitement. "And experiments you can try yourself." Margaret smiled, surprised by how natural it felt to share his enthusiasm. "Well then, we'd better see everything, shouldn't we?" Lila joined them, her expression carefully neutral. She'd agreed to this outing after much consideration, and Margaret could sense her watchful presence, like a protective shadow. Inside, Oliver's excitement exploded. He darted from exhibit to exhibit, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. At the interactive engineering station, he immediately dove into building a simple machine with colorful gears and levers. "Look, Ms. Margaret," he called out. "If I connect these gears just right, it makes the whole thing move together." Margaret knelt beside him, her expensive skirt touching the floor without a second thought. "That's brilliant, Oliver. You've got quite an eye for mechanics." A museum guide approached, drawn by Oliver's enthusiasm. "Would you like to try our new robotics demonstration?" she offered. Oliver looked hopefully at his mother. Lila hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead, sweetheart." As they watched Oliver work with the basic programming interface, Margaret noticed Lila's tense posture. "He's remarkable," Margaret said softly. "The way his mind works, he sees connections others might miss." Lila's expression softened slightly. "He gets lost in it sometimes. Last week he took apart our toaster to see how it worked." A small smile played at her lips. "Actually got it back together too." Margaret watched Oliver's face scrunch in concentration as he solved a programming puzzle. Something tugged at her heart, a feeling she couldn't quite name. When was the last time she'd felt such pure joy and discovery? Her own childhood had been filled with tutors and expectations, success measured in test scores and achievements. They moved through the exhibits, Oliver's excitement never wavering. At the physics demonstration, he asked questions that impressed even the senior researcher. Margaret found herself taking mental notes, already planning future visits, other opportunities to nurture his curiosity. During lunch in the museum cafe, Oliver chattered about everything they'd seen while devouring his sandwich. Margaret noticed Lila checking the prices on the menu with careful eyes, and smoothly suggested they use the museum membership pass she'd acquired, which included meal vouchers. "I haven't been to a museum in years," Margaret admitted, stirring her coffee. "I forgot how fascinating they can be." "Too busy with important business stuff?" Oliver asked innocently. The question hit harder than Margaret expected. She'd filled her life with meetings, deals, and endless phone calls. When had she last done anything simply for the joy of it? "Sometimes grown-ups forget to make time for wonderful things," she said carefully, meeting Lila's observant gaze. "We get caught up in what we think matters and miss what really does." Oliver nodded sagely as if this made perfect sense, then spotted the dessert counter. "Mom, can we get ice cream?" As Lila and Oliver went to choose flavors, Margaret watched them together. The way Lila's guard dropped when she smiled at her son, the complete trust in Oliver's upturned face. Her own life suddenly felt empty in comparison. Despite all its luxuries, she'd built an empire of wealth and influence, but somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten to build connections that mattered. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Margaret's corner office, casting long shadows across her polished desk. She was reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Pierce, there's someone here to see you. He says he's your brother." Margaret's fingers froze over her keyboard. A familiar ache bloomed in her chest, one she'd spent years trying to ignore. "I'm in a meeting," she said automatically. "He says he'll wait." Of course he would. David had always been stubborn. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the last time they'd spoken, at their father's funeral 5 years ago. The argument about the family business, about choices made and paths taken, still echoed in her mind. When she finally allowed him in, David looked older than she remembered. His dark hair had touches of gray at the temples, and his eyes carried the same weariness she sometimes saw in her own reflection. "Hello, Maggie," he said softly, using the childhood nickname she'd long since abandoned. "It's Margaret," she corrected, her voice clipped. "What do you want, David?" He shifted uncomfortably, looking around her pristine office. "I've been thinking about us, about everything. Mom's not getting any younger, and He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I miss my sister." "Hey." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered in her chest. "We've both made our choices. I'm very busy and—" "You're always busy," David interrupted. "That's been your excuse for missing every holiday, every family gathering. When was the last time you even called Mom?" "I send cards," Margaret said defensively, though the words sounded hollow even to her ears. "Cards." David shook his head. "We're family, Maggie. That used to mean something to you." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "If that's all, I have a meeting to prepare for." Later that week, during their regular museum visit, Oliver was unusually quiet as they walked through the butterfly garden. Margaret had been telling him about a new engineering exhibit when she mentioned David's visit in passing. "Why don't you want to see your brother?" Oliver asked suddenly, his innocent question cutting through her carefully constructed defenses. Margaret stumbled over her words. "It's complicated, Oliver. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that are hard to fix." "But he's your family," Oliver said, watching a monarch butterfly land on a nearby flower. "When I fight with my friend Tommy at school, Mom says we should talk it out and try to understand each other." Margaret felt something crack in her carefully maintained facade. She thought about Lila's protective stance whenever she was around Oliver, the slow way she'd begun to lower her guards. Wasn't she doing the same thing, keeping David at arm's length, protecting herself from potential hurt? "Mom says family is special," Oliver continued, oblivious to Margaret's internal struggle. "She says even when we're mad at each other, love doesn't go away. It just gets hidden sometimes, like when clouds cover the sun." Margaret's throat tightened. She watched Oliver reach out carefully toward the butterfly, his face full of wonder and openness. How had this child become so wise? And how had she, with all her success and sophistication, become so closed off? The parallel struck her hard. She was doing to David exactly what she'd initially criticized Lila for doing to her, building walls, assuming the worst, refusing to let anyone close enough to matter. The realization left her feeling exposed and uncomfortable. "Oliver," she said softly, "when did you get so smart about these things?" He just shrugged, still focused on the butterfly. "It's not smart, Ms. Margaret. It's just love." The Science Museum towered before them, its glass dome glinting in the morning sun. Margaret watched as Oliver bounced excitedly beside her, his worn sneakers barely containing his enthusiasm. She'd chosen this particular Saturday for their visit, knowing the museum had just opened a new robotics exhibit. "Look, Ms. Margaret." Oliver pointed to a giant mechanical dinosaur that moved its head back and forth near the entrance. "Do you think it has real gears inside, like the ones in my book?" Margaret smiled, remembering the engineering book she'd given him last week. "Why don't we ask the tour guide? I'm sure they'll know all about it." Inside, they joined a small group gathering for the morning tour. The guide, a young woman with bright red hair and a name tag reading Sarah, began explaining the museum's highlights. Oliver stood at the front, his hand shooting up every few minutes with questions that made Sarah's eyes light up with surprise and delight. "The pneumatic system in this robotic arm," Sarah explained, "uses compressed air to—" "Like in brake lines on cars?" Oliver interrupted, then quickly added, "Sorry, Mom says I shouldn't interrupt." Sarah beamed. "That's exactly right. How did you know that?" "I read about it," Oliver said proudly. "And I tried making something like it with plastic tubes and a bicycle pump, but it didn't work very well." Margaret felt her chest swell with pride as several adults in the group exchanged impressed looks. Oliver continued asking thoughtful questions throughout the tour, each one revealing his deep curiosity and natural understanding of mechanical concepts. After the tour, they stopped at the museum cafe for lunch. Margaret watched Oliver carefully unwrap the sandwich Lila had packed for him while she ordered coffee. As she waited in line, she overheard a boy at a nearby table whisper to his mother, "Why is that kid wearing such weird clothes? They look like they're from the garbage store." Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee cup. She glanced at Oliver's threadbare jacket and the slightly too short pants that showed his ankles. The urge to march over and say something to the other mother rose in her throat like bile. But what could she say? That Oliver's worth wasn't measured by his clothes? That his brilliant mind and kind heart mattered more than any designer label? The words felt hollow, especially coming from someone who'd spent years judging others based on their appearance and status. Oliver remained blissfully unaware of the comment, excitedly telling Margaret about the robotics exhibit they'd just seen. "And did you see how the arm could pick up eggs without breaking them? I think if I adjusted my recycling sorter design, I could make it gentler like that." Margaret forced herself to focus on Oliver's enthusiasm rather than her own discomfort. She'd spent her entire adult life in boardrooms and luxury boutiques where worth was measured in stock options and brand names. Now, watching Oliver's eyes shine with pure joy as he talked about his inventions, she felt those values shifting beneath her feet like sand. "Ms. Margaret?" Oliver's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Are you okay? You look sad." "I'm not sad at all," she assured him, meaning it despite her inner turmoil. "I'm just thinking about how impressive you were today. Those were very smart questions you asked." Oliver's face lit up with a smile that made Margaret's earlier anger melt away. "Really? I was worried I asked too many questions. Sometimes the kids at school say I talk too much about inventor stuff." The PTA meeting buzzed with the usual chatter about bake sales and fundraisers, but tonight something else had caught everyone's attention. Lila sat quietly in the back row of the school's multi-purpose room, organizing papers for the upcoming field trip she was helping coordinate. "Did you hear about the new STEM scholarship?" Mrs. Thompson whispered to another parent 2 rows ahead. "Someone anonymous donated enough money to cover one student's entire educational journey through college." Lila's hand stilled on the papers. "And little Oliver got it," Mrs. Baker chimed in. "Such a bright boy, someone important must have noticed his potential." The pieces started falling into place in Lila's mind. The timing of the scholarship, right after Margaret's increased involvement in Oliver's life. The specific focus on inventions and engineering, exactly what Oliver loved. The way Margaret had been spending more time at the school, talking to teachers and administrators. Her chest tightened as the reality sank in. How could she have been so blind? After the meeting, Lila spotted Margaret in the parking lot, climbing into her luxury car. Without hesitation, she marched over, her footsteps sharp against the asphalt. "Was it you?" Lila's voice came out harder than she'd intended. "The scholarship?" Margaret froze, her hand still on the car door. The look of guilt that flashed across her face was all the confirmation Lila needed. "I can explain," Margaret started, but Lila cut her off. "Explain what? How you went behind my back? How you couldn't resist playing savior to the poor single mother and her son?" Lila's voice shook with anger and hurt. "We don't need your charity, Margaret. We never did." "It wasn't charity," Margaret protested. "Oliver has such potential. I just wanted to help." "Help?" Lila laughed bitterly. "By making me look incompetent? By showing everyone that my son needs rescuing from his circumstances?" Her eyes stung with angry tears. "I've worked 2 jobs since his father died to give him everything he needs, everything. We may not have designer clothes or fancy cars, but we have our dignity." "Mom?" Oliver's small voice came from behind them. He stood there clutching his backpack, confusion written across his face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart," Lila said quickly, but Oliver was already looking between them with dawning understanding. "Is this about the scholarship?" he asked quietly. "The one my teacher told me about today?" Margaret stepped forward. "Oliver, I only wanted to—" "Don't!" Lila interrupted sharply. "You've done enough." She turned to Oliver, holding out her hand. "Come on, honey, we're going home." "But Ms. Margaret—" Oliver's voice wavered. "Now, Oliver," Lila said firmly, though her heart broke at the tears welling up in his eyes. As they walked away, Lila could hear Margaret calling after them, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see the hurt on Oliver's face, or the genuine distress in Margaret's voice. The betrayal cut too deep, not just for herself, but for what it meant about their entire relationship. Had it all been built on pity? On Margaret's need to fix what she saw as broken? Oliver's small hand trembled in hers as they walked to their car. "Mom, why are you mad at Ms. Margaret? She was just trying to help me become an inventor." Lila swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "Sometimes, sweetheart, help that comes the wrong way isn't really help at all." The corner office on the 42nd floor felt colder than ever. Margaret sat at her desk, staring at the untouched stack of reports before her. The city sprawled out beyond her window, a maze of buildings and streets that seemed as empty as her heart felt. 2 weeks had passed since that night in the school parking lot. 2 weeks without Oliver's excited chatter about his latest invention ideas. 2 weeks without Lila's cautious but warming smiles. The silence was deafening. Margaret picked up her phone for the 100th time, scrolling to Oliver's contact information. His school picture smiled back at her, gap-toothed and bright-eyed. Her thumb hovered over the call button before she set the phone down again with a heavy sigh. "You look terrible," a familiar voice said from her doorway. Margaret looked up to find David leaning against the frame, concern etched across his features. She hadn't called him, but somehow he knew to come. "I'm fine," she said automatically, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. David pulled up a chair and sat down. "Really? Because the Margaret I know doesn't miss board meetings or forget to return client calls." "I've been busy," she defended weakly. "You've been hiding," David corrected gently. "Just like you did after Mom and Dad's divorce. Just like you did when I tried to reach out last year." Margaret's hands stilled on the papers. "This is different." "Is it?" David leaned forward. "You made a mistake with Lila and Oliver, a well-intentioned one, but still a mistake. Instead of facing it, you're doing what you always do, retreating behind these walls you've built." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. "I was trying to help." "I know," David said softly. "But sometimes helping means being vulnerable first, showing people who you really are, not just what you can give them." Margaret wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers. "I miss them," she whispered. "I miss Oliver's laugh and his crazy ideas. I miss watching Lila try not to smile when he gets excited about something. I miss feeling like I belonged somewhere." David reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. "Then tell them that. Tell Lila why Oliver's dreams matter so much to you. Tell her about growing up in this world of privilege where everything had a price tag but nothing had real value." Margaret pulled a piece of paper from her desk drawer. "I've been trying to write to her," she admitted, "but everything sounds wrong." "Stop trying to make it perfect," David advised. "Just make it real." Margaret picked up her pen and began to write, her usually precise handwriting shaky with emotion. "Dear Lila, I owe you an apology, but more than that, I owe you the truth. When I was Oliver's age, I had everything money could buy, but what I wanted most was someone to believe in my dreams. My parents saw dreams as distractions from success. They replaced encouragement with expectations, love with achievements. When I met Oliver, I saw in him everything I wished I'd been allowed to be. Curious, hopeful, unafraid to imagine. I thought I could protect those qualities in him by removing the obstacles I faced. But in doing so, I disrespected you and the incredible job you've done raising him." Margaret paused, looking up at David with tear-filled eyes. "What if she doesn't read it?" "Then at least you'll know you tried," David said. "Sometimes that's all we can do. Be honest and hope it's enough." Margaret nodded and bent back over the letter, her heart pouring onto the page as she finally allowed herself to be truly vulnerable. The morning sun streamed through the classroom windows, but Oliver barely noticed. His head rested on his hand as he stared blankly at the math worksheet in front of him. The same problem had been waiting for his attention for the past 10 minutes. "Oliver?" Mrs. Thompson's gentle voice broke through his daze. "The bell rang for recess. Would you like to go outside?" He shook his head, pushing the unfinished worksheet away. "Can I stay here?" Mrs. Thompson pulled up a chair beside his desk, her kind face creased with concern. The usually bright and talkative boy had become quieter over the past few weeks. His creative stories about inventions had stopped, and his hand no longer shot up eagerly during science lessons. "You know," she said carefully, "it's okay to miss people who aren't in our lives anymore." Oliver's lower lip trembled slightly. "I don't want to talk about Ms. Pierce." At home that evening, Lila stood at the kitchen sink, watching Oliver through the window as he sat alone on the back steps. His favorite invention notebook lay untouched beside him. The sight made her heart ache. "Baby, dinner's ready," she called out, trying to keep her voice cheerful. Oliver came inside slowly, settling at the kitchen table without his usual chatter about his day. Lila set a plate of spaghetti in front of him, then sat down across from her son. "How was school today?" she asked. "Fine," Oliver mumbled, pushing the pasta around his plate. "Mrs. Thompson called," Lila said softly. "She's worried about you. Said you're having trouble concentrating in class." Oliver's fork clattered against his plate. "I just don't feel like doing stuff anymore." Lila reached across the table and touched his hand. "Honey, I know things have been different since everything happened. Do you want to talk about it?" "Why can't Ms. Pierce come visit anymore?" Oliver's voice was small. "She didn't do anything bad. She just wanted to help." Lila felt her throat tighten. The hurt and anger she'd felt at Margaret's secret scholarship still stung, but seeing her son's spirit dim was worse. "Sometimes grown-ups make things complicated," she said carefully. "But she made me feel special," Oliver whispered. "Like my ideas mattered. Like being different was okay." Across town, Margaret sat in her office reading an email from Mrs. Thompson for the third time. The teacher's words painted a clear picture of Oliver's struggles, his falling grades, his withdrawal from activities, his loss of enthusiasm. Each sentence felt like a knife in Margaret's heart. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out the letter she'd written days ago but hadn't sent. The pages were slightly crumpled from being handled so many times. Margaret had memorized every word, her apology, her explanation, her truth. But fear had kept her from sending it. Now, knowing that Oliver was suffering, the fear began to feel selfish. She thought of David's words about vulnerability, about showing people who you really are. Oliver had shown her who he was from the very beginning, brave, kind, and genuine. He deserved the same from her. Margaret reached for her phone, then stopped. No, this needed to be done right. She couldn't hide behind technology or money anymore. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the letter and her car keys. It was time to face Lila in person, to show her that some things were worth more than pride, like a little boy's smile and his dreams of changing the world. Margaret's hands trembled as she stood on Lila's front porch, clutching the wrinkled letter. The evening air felt heavy with humidity, matching the weight in her chest. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Footsteps approached from inside and Lila's voice called out, "Who is it?" "It's Margaret Pierce," she answered, her voice shakier than she'd intended. The door opened just enough for Lila to peer through, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" "Please," Margaret said softly. "I need to explain. I know I hurt you and Oliver, and I need to make this right." "There's nothing to explain." Lila's hand tightened on the door frame. "You went behind my back. You made decisions about my son without talking to me." "You're right," Margaret admitted. "I did everything wrong, but please just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Lila stood silent for a long moment, then opened the door wider. 5 minutes. Margaret stepped into the familiar living room, noticing how empty it felt without Oliver's cheerful presence. She heard a slight creak from upstairs, the sound of small feet trying to be quiet. "I brought this," Margaret said, holding out the letter. "I've been trying to find the right words to explain why I did what I did." Lila took the letter but didn't open it. "You could have just asked me." "I know that now." Margaret's shoulders sagged. "But asking for things, being honest about feelings, it's not something I learned growing up." She sank onto the edge of the couch, her perfectly tailored suit suddenly feeling like armor she didn't need. "My parents believed success meant everything. Emotions were weakness, needing help was failure." Lila's expression softened slightly as she sat in the chair across from Margaret. "The day Oliver helped me in the park," Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion, "was the first time in decades someone showed me genuine kindness without wanting anything in return. He didn't care about my status or my money, he just saw someone who needed help." Margaret wiped at her eyes, surprised to find tears there. "When I learned about his dreams, his brilliant mind, I saw myself at his age. But where I had every opportunity and no love, he has all this love but limited opportunities. I thought I could fix it with money because that's all I know how to do." "We don't need fixing," Lila said firmly, but her tone had lost its edge. "No, you don't," Margaret agreed. "You're an amazing mother, Lila. Oliver is kind, brave, and wonderful because of you. I should have respected that instead of trying to control things from the shadows." A floorboard creaked overhead and both women glanced up. Lila called out gently, "Oliver, honey, I know you're listening." There was a pause, then the sound of small feet padding down the stairs. Oliver appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide as he looked between his mother and Margaret. "I'm sorry, Oliver," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry I hurt you and your mom. I was trying to help, but I did it the wrong way." Oliver took a step forward, his expression serious. "Mom always says it's okay to make mistakes if you learn from them." Lila reached out and touched her son's shoulder, her eyes meeting Margaret's. "She's right about that." She held up the letter. "I'll read this, and we'll think about what you've said." Margaret nodded, understanding this was all she could ask for now. As she stood to leave, she saw hope in Oliver's eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. A week after Margaret's apology, she sat in her office, staring at a stack of papers without really seeing them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk, and her coffee had gone cold hours ago. Her thoughts kept drifting to Oliver and Lila, wondering if they'd read her letter. A soft knock on her door startled her. "Come in," she called, expecting her assistant. Instead, a small figure slipped through the door. Oliver stood there, his backpack clutched to his chest, looking uncertain but determined. "Oliver!" Margaret gasped, rising from her chair. "What are you doing here? Does your mother know where you are?" Oliver shifted from foot to foot. Not exactly. I told my teacher I had to use the bathroom, but I came here instead. His bottom lip trembled. I really missed you, Margaret. Margaret's heart clenched. She walked around her desk and knelt in front of him. Oh, Oliver, I've missed you too so much. But your mom will be worried sick. I know, he said, his voice small. But I had to see you. Mom read your letter 3 times. I saw her crying, but she wouldn't tell me why. Margaret guided Oliver to the small sofa in her office. Sometimes grown-ups cry because they're trying to figure things out in their hearts. Oliver looked up at her with those earnest eyes that had first melted her defenses. Are you going to disappear again? Because Tommy at school said his dad disappeared and never came back. No, Oliver. Margaret's voice was firm but gentle. I promise you, I will never disappear from your life. Even if things are complicated right now, I'll always be here for you. Really? Hope bloomed in his expression. Really? She squeezed his hand. But we need to do things the right way this time. That means being honest with your mom and respecting her wishes. Oliver's shoulders slumped. But what if she says we can't see each other anymore? Then we'll find a way to make it work that makes everyone comfortable. Margaret smiled softly. Your mom loves you more than anything in the world. She just wants to protect you. I know, Oliver said. But you need protecting too sometimes. Like that day in the park. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. Before she could respond, her office door opened again. Lila stood there, slightly out of breath, worry etched on her face. Oliver? Lila exclaimed. Do you have any idea how scared I was when the school called? I'm sorry, Mom, Oliver said, hanging his head. I just really needed to see Margaret. Lila's expression softened as she took in the scene before her. Margaret and Oliver sitting close together, their genuine care for each other evident in their postures and expressions. I should have called you right away, Margaret said. I was just about to. Lila walked into the office, her steps measured. She looked at her son, then at Margaret. He talks about you all the time, you know, even after everything that happened. Margaret swallowed hard. I think about him all the time, too. I can see that, Lila said quietly. She sat down on Oliver's other side. Maybe we can work something out. Set some boundaries, talk things through properly this time. Oliver's face lit up. Really? Really, Lila confirmed, though her voice held a note of caution. But no more sneaking around, young man. We all need to be honest with each other. The following Saturday morning, Margaret stood on Lila's front porch, her heart beating faster than usual. She smoothed her casual sweater, deliberately chosen instead of her usual business attire, and knocked on the door. Lila opened it, looking surprised to see Margaret there. I wasn't expecting you today. I know, and I'm sorry for dropping by unannounced, Margaret said, her voice gentle. But I have something important I'd like to discuss with you. Something that could help not just Oliver, but many children at the school. Lila hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. Oliver's in his room working on another invention. The small living room felt warmer than Margaret remembered. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator, and a half-finished science project sat on the coffee table. The sight made her smile. Would you like some coffee? Lila offered, her tone cautiously neutral. Yes, thank you, Margaret replied, settling onto the worn but comfortable couch. As Lila prepared the coffee, Margaret heard the familiar sound of Oliver tinkering in his room, the soft clink of tools and his quiet humming. The sound gave her courage. I've been thinking a lot about Oliver, Margaret began when Lila returned with 2 steaming mugs, and about all the other children at his school who might have big dreams but limited opportunities. Lila sat down, her posture stiff. Go on. I'd like to propose a mentorship program at the school, Margaret said, warming her hands around the coffee mug. Not as a charity project, but as a community initiative. Something that connects children with local professionals who can nurture their interests and talents. And you would fund this program? Lila asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Margaret shook her head. I would help organize it, yes, but it would be a collaborative effort. Local businesses, community leaders, parents, everyone contributing what they can. Time, expertise, resources. The focus would be on building relationships, not throwing money at problems. The sound of small footsteps interrupted them as Oliver appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up at the sight of Margaret. Margaret, you're here. Hi, sweetheart. Margaret smiled warmly. I heard you working on something in there. I'm making a robot that can sort recycling, he announced proudly. Want to see? In a minute, honey, Lila said gently. Margaret and I are talking about something important. Oliver nodded seriously and retreated to his room, though they could tell he was listening from just around the corner. Lila's expression softened as she watched her son. Tell me more about this program. Children like Oliver would be matched with mentors in their areas of interest, Margaret explained. Engineers, scientists, artists, whatever speaks to their passions. We'd organize workshops, field trips, hands-on projects. But most importantly, it would be about building confidence and showing these kids that their dreams are valid, regardless of their circumstances. And how would families participate? Lila asked, her professional experience as a mother showing through. That's actually where I hoped you might help, Margaret said carefully. Your insight would be invaluable in designing this program. You understand these families' needs and concerns better than anyone. Lila sat back, surprise flickering across her face. You want my help? More than that, Margaret leaned forward. I'd like you to be my partner in this. Equal voices, equal input. We could meet with Principal Stevens next week to discuss the framework. From his hiding spot, Oliver let out an excited squeak. Both women couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. Lila was quiet for a moment, studying her coffee. It's an interesting idea, she admitted. And you're right. These kids need more than just financial support. They need people who believe in them. Like you believe in Oliver, Margaret said softly. Lila looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. Okay, she said finally. I'll attend the meeting with Principal Stevens, but no promises beyond that. Principal Stevens' office felt cramped with 6 people squeezed inside. Margaret sat straight-backed in her chair, while Lila perched on the edge of hers. Oliver had insisted on coming, and now sat between them, swinging his legs and clutching his latest invention, a small wind-powered battery made from recycled materials. 2 PTA members, Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Baker, occupied the remaining chairs, their expressions guarded. Principal Stevens stood behind his desk, reviewing the proposal Margaret and Lila had prepared. This is quite comprehensive, Principal Stevens said, looking up from the papers. A community-based mentorship program could really benefit our students. Margaret nodded. We envision matching students with professionals who share their interests. Engineers, artists, scientists, people who can show them what's possible. And how exactly would this be funded? Mrs. Thompson interrupted, her tone sharp. Or is this just another publicity stunt for Pierce Industries? The room grew quiet. Oliver stopped swinging his legs and looked up at Margaret with worried eyes. Margaret felt her chest tighten but kept her voice steady. The program would be funded through community partnerships and local businesses. I'm happy to help secure initial funding, but this isn't about me or my company. It's about giving children opportunities they deserve. That's easy to say when you're worth millions, Mrs. Thompson pressed. The local papers would love this story. Wealthy CEO saves underprivileged children. That's enough, Lila spoke up, surprising everyone. I had the same doubts at first, but Margaret has proven she genuinely cares about these children. She's not looking for publicity. She's trying to make a difference. Oliver reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. The simple gesture nearly brought tears to her eyes. Principal Stevens cleared his throat. The proposal seems sound, but we'll need PTA support to move forward. Mrs. Pierce, would you be willing to work directly with the PTA to develop the funding structure and volunteer network? Of course, Margaret agreed quickly. And please call me Margaret. Mrs. Baker, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. What about the families who might feel uncomfortable accepting help? We don't want to create any stigma. That's actually why we'd like Lila to co-lead the program, Margaret explained. She understands the community's perspective and can help ensure we approach this sensitively. Lila nodded. The focus would be on building relationships, not charity. Every family has something to contribute, whether it's time, skills, or resources. Look what I made, Oliver burst out, unable to contain himself any longer. He held up his small invention. Margaret helped me understand how wind power works, and Mom helped me find the parts, and now it can charge a phone. The adults couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. Even Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. This is exactly what we're talking about, Principal Stevens said, gesturing to Oliver's creation. Nurturing this kind of potential. Margaret, Lila, if you can work with the PTA to finalize the details, I think we should move forward. As they left the office, Margaret felt drained. The accusation about publicity had stung more than she wanted to admit. Hey, Lila touched her arm gently. Don't let Mrs. Thompson get to you. Some people take longer to trust change. Thank you, Margaret said quietly, for defending me in there. Well, Lila gave her a small smile. Maybe this program can be a fresh start for all of us. Oliver beamed up at them both, clutching his invention. Does this mean we can help other kids make cool stuff too? Margaret sat in her brother David's living room, fidgeting with her coffee cup. Sunlight streamed through the bay windows, warming the cozy space that felt so different from her own stark modern apartment. Family photos lined the walls, moments she'd missed over the years of estrangement. So, David said, settling into his worn leather armchair. You want my help with this mentorship program? His gentle tone held none of the judgment she'd feared. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. You've always been good with people, David. You know how to build community support. I don't. All I know is boardrooms and profit margins. David leaned forward, his expression softening. Remember when we were kids? You used to organize neighborhood talent shows to raise money for the animal shelter. That was different, Margaret protested, but a smile tugged at her lips. I was 12. No, it wasn't different at all. You've always had a big heart, Maggie. You just buried it under spreadsheets and stock options. The childhood nickname hit her hard. Nobody had called her Maggie in years. I really messed up, didn't I? Pushing everyone away? We all make mistakes, David said, but you're trying to make things right. That matters. He pulled out a notebook. Now tell me more about this program. I know some local business owners who might be interested in mentoring. As they worked through the details, sharing ideas and occasional laughs, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The wall she'd built between them began to crumble. Remember that summer we tried to build a treehouse? David asked, chuckling. Dad kept saying we needed a blueprint, but you insisted on creative architecture. Margaret laughed. It collapsed after 2 days, but we had so much fun building it. That's the sister I remember, David said softly. The one who believed anything was possible. The next day they met with Lila at the local diner to discuss their plans. Lila noticed immediately how different Margaret seemed around her brother. More relaxed, more genuine. The sharp business exterior had softened. David's agreed to help coordinate with local businesses, Margaret explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. He knows everyone in town, and they trust him. It's true, David admitted with a modest shrug. 20 years of running the community center gives you some connections. Lila watched them interact, noting the easy way they finished each other's sentences despite their years apart. You two are a lot alike, she observed. Oh no, David laughed. Margaret's the ambitious one. I'm just the guy who never left town. And became its heart and soul, Margaret added quietly. I should have seen that sooner. Lila saw the flash of regret cross Margaret's face, followed by David's gentle pat on her hand. This wasn't the same woman who'd first walked into their lives, polished, distant, and guarded. This Margaret was learning to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to reconnect. You know, Lila said, Oliver's going to be thrilled to have both of you involved in the program. He's already started designing posters for it. Speaking of Oliver, David grinned. Did Margaret tell you about the time she tried to invent a robot dog? She was about his age. David, no. Margaret groaned, but she was laughing. As David launched into the story, Margaret caught Lila's eye across the table. In that moment, they shared an understanding. Sometimes healing came in unexpected ways, through unlikely connections and second chances. The school gymnasium felt cavernous with only a dozen people scattered among the rows of folding chairs. Margaret stood at the podium, her prepared speech clutched tightly in her hands as she surveyed the sparse crowd. This wasn't the turnout she'd hoped for. David caught her eye from the back of the room and gave her an encouraging nod. Lila sat in the front row, her expression a mix of sympathy and concern. Thank you all for coming today, Margaret began, her voice echoing slightly in the half-empty space. We're here to discuss an exciting new mentorship program that could make a real difference in our children's lives. As she spoke about the program's goals and structure, she noticed a few people checking their phones or whispering to each other. Her confidence wavered. This wasn't like presenting to a boardroom of executives. These were parents and teachers who needed to believe in the program's heart, not just its logistics. Halfway through her presentation, Oliver slipped away from Lila's side and walked up to the podium. He tugged gently on Margaret's sleeve. "Can I say something?" he whispered, his eyes bright with determination. Margaret hesitated, glancing at Lila, who looked equally surprised but nodded her approval. "Of course, Oliver," Margaret said, stepping aside. Oliver had to stand on his tiptoes to reach the microphone. "Hi, everyone," he said, his small voice carrying across the gym. "I know some of you might think this program isn't important, but it is. Really important." The phone checkers looked up, caught by the earnestness in his voice. "I want to be an inventor when I grow up," Oliver continued. "But sometimes kids make fun of me because my mom and I don't have lots of money. They say I can't do it." His voice grew stronger. "But then I met Ms. Pierce. She believes in me. She takes me to museums and shows me that dreams can come true if you work hard and have people who help you." Margaret felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Across the room, David was beaming with pride. "There are lots of kids like me," Oliver said. "We just need someone to believe in us. Maybe you could be that someone for another kid. It would mean everything." The gym fell silent for a moment. Then one of the parents stood up. "My husband owns a small engineering firm," she said. "We'd be happy to host some workshops for the kids." Another parent raised his hand. "I teach art at the community college. I could help with creative projects." More hands went up, more voices joined in. Margaret watched in amazement as the energy in the room transformed. People who had seemed disinterested minutes ago were now clustering together, exchanging ideas and contact information. Lila made her way to the podium and wrapped an arm around Oliver's shoulders. "That was beautiful, sweetheart," she whispered. "Indeed it was," Margaret agreed, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt down to Oliver's level. "You just showed everyone exactly why this program matters." David joined them, carrying a sign-up sheet with several new names. "Looks like we've got our first batch of mentors," he said with a grin. Margaret looked around the gym where small groups were still chatting enthusiastically. The space no longer felt too big. It felt full of possibility. She caught Lila's eye, and they shared a smile of quiet triumph. Sometimes the most powerful changes started small, with just one voice brave enough to speak up. The news hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. Standing in her office, she stared at the email from Mrs. Davidson, one of their key volunteers who owned a local tech company. The message was polite but clear. She was withdrawing her support from the mentorship program. "I've heard concerning things about your true motivations," the email read. "While I appreciate the initiative, I cannot attach my company's name to something that might be more about personal image than helping children." Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her phone. She knew exactly where these rumors had started. Sandra Wheeler, the outspoken PTA member who'd questioned her intentions at the first meeting, had been particularly vocal lately. David found her still sitting at her desk an hour later, surrounded by scattered program documents. "I heard about Mrs. Davidson," he said softly, pulling up a chair beside her. It's not just her, Margaret replied, her voice tight. 3 other volunteers have backed out this morning. Sandra's been telling people I'm using this program to repair my corporate image after that scandal at Pierce Industries last year. She rubbed her temples. A scandal that never even happened. Then we'll fight back with the truth, David said firmly. Show them who you really are. The door opened, and Lila stepped in, looking determined. I just heard what's happening, she said. I've already called 5 other parents who are still on board. They're standing with us. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. Just months ago, Lila had been the one doubting her motives. Now, here she was, fighting in Margaret's corner. Mrs. Wheeler doesn't know what she's talking about, came a small voice from behind Lila. Oliver peeked around his mother, clutching a piece of paper to his chest. Oliver insisted on coming when he heard you were upset, Lila explained with a gentle smile. Oliver approached Margaret's desk, carefully unfolding his paper. I made this for the program, he said proudly, smoothing out the creases. Margaret leaned forward to look. Oliver had drawn what appeared to be a logo, a circle of stick figures holding hands, each wearing different colored clothes and sporting huge smiles. Above them, in wobbly letters, he'd written, Everyone dreams big together. See? Oliver pointed to the figures. That's you, and Mom, and Uncle David, and me, and all the other kids who need help with their dreams. The circle means no one gets left out. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes as she studied the drawing. Each stick figure had been carefully detailed. One wore a suit like hers, another had Lila's curly hair, and one small figure wore what looked like a lab coat with a pencil behind its ear. This is perfect, Oliver, she whispered, touching the paper gently. This is exactly what our program is about. Can we use it? Oliver asked eagerly. For real? I think it's exactly what we need, David agreed, examining the drawing. Simple, honest, straight from the heart, just like this program should be. Lila stepped forward, placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder. Sandra Wheeler can spread all the rumors she wants, she said firmly. Those of us who know you, who've seen how much you care about these kids, we're not going anywhere. Margaret looked around at her unlikely family, her once estranged brother, the single mother who'd become her closest ally, and the little boy whose pure heart had started it all. Oliver's drawing seemed to glow with possibility on her desk, a reminder of why she'd begun this journey in the first place. You're right, she said, straightening her shoulders. We're not giving up. Not when we've come this far. The school gymnasium buzzed with quiet chatter as parents and teachers filed in for the morning assembly. Margaret stood behind the podium, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. The familiar faces of skeptics like Sandra Wheeler mixed with those who had supported the program, creating a sea of uncertainty before her. Principal Roberts stepped up to introduce her, his voice warm and encouraging. Today, we're fortunate to have Margaret Pierce speak about our new mentorship program. Many of you may know her as a successful businesswoman, but there's more to her story. As Margaret took her place at the microphone, she caught sight of Oliver sitting in the front row between Lila and David. The boy gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up, his bright smile cutting through her nervousness like a ray of sunshine. Good morning, Margaret began, her voice shakier than she'd hoped. She took a deep breath and looked down at her prepared speech, then pushed it aside. I had a whole speech written out, but I think it's time for something more honest. The gymnasium grew quieter, and Margaret could feel all eyes on her. 6 months ago, I collapsed in Patterson Park. I was too busy barking orders into my phone to notice I was about to faint. But a 6-year-old boy noticed. She smiled at Oliver. He not only called for help, but stayed with me, holding my hand and telling me everything would be okay. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. What none of you know is that I grew up in a house where success meant everything and emotions meant nothing. My parents were wealthy but distant. My brother and I, she glanced at David, grew apart because I thought power and money were more important than family. A few parents shifted in their seats, their expressions softening. Even Sandra Wheeler's usual frown had faded into something more thoughtful. That day in the park, Oliver showed me more genuine kindness than I'd experienced in years. And when I met his mother, Lila, Margaret's eyes welled with tears. I saw someone who gave everything for her child's dreams despite having so little. It made me question everything about my life. Lila dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, reaching over to squeeze Oliver's shoulder. This mentorship program isn't about publicity or corporate image, Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. It's about making sure every child like Oliver has the chance to dream big, regardless of their circumstances. It's about building the kind of community I wish I'd had growing up. She paused, looking directly at those who had doubted her. I understand your skepticism. I've given people plenty of reasons to doubt me over the years. But this program, these children, they represent everything I want to change about myself and our community. As Margaret finished speaking, the gymnasium remained silent for a moment. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, someone began to clap. The applause spread slowly at first, then built into a wave of support that filled the room. Lila stood up, making her way to the podium. In front of everyone, she wrapped Margaret in a tight hug. "I'm sorry I doubted you," she whispered, loud enough for only Margaret to hear. "Thank you for not giving up on Oliver, on the program, on us." Margaret hugged her back, tears flowing freely now. When they separated, she saw parents lining up at the volunteer sign-up table by the gymnasium door. Sandra Wheeler was among them, clutching a registration form and wearing an expression that looked remarkably like respect. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a bustling science fair, with handmade posters and project displays filling every available space. At table number 16, Oliver stood nervously adjusting his small invention, a wind-powered phone charger made from recycled materials. Margaret had helped him gather the supplies, but the design was all his own. "You've got this," Margaret whispered, straightening the Future Inventors banner she'd made for his booth. The paper was decorated with little light bulbs and gears that Oliver had drawn himself. Lila fussed with Oliver's collar, her eyes bright with pride. "Remember what we practiced, honey. Nice and clear, just like at home." The fair had drawn quite a crowd. Parents, teachers, and community members wandered between the displays, but Oliver's booth seemed to attract special attention. His invention, though simple, showed remarkable creativity for a 6-year-old. "Can you tell me how it works?" asked Mr. Chen, a well-known local inventor who'd been invited as a special guest. He leaned in closer, genuinely interested in Oliver's creation. Oliver's face lit up. "Well, sir, when the wind blows, it spins these old computer fan blades I found. They're connected to this part from an old toy car which makes electricity." His small hands gestured enthusiastically as he explained each component. Mr. Chen nodded approvingly. "And you thought of this all by yourself?" "Yes, sir. Ms. Margaret helped me get the parts, but I designed it." Oliver beamed with pride. "I wanted to help people charge their phones without using regular electricity, to help the Earth." From across the room, Sandra Wheeler watched with narrowed eyes. She huddled with 2 other PTA members, whispering behind their programs. Convenient that Pierce brought in her inventor friend, probably trying to get good publicity for her company's new green energy division. The whispers spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Some parents began giving Margaret suspicious looks, and a few even steered their children away from Oliver's booth. Principal Roberts overheard the murmurs and frowned. He'd seen Margaret's genuine transformation over the past months and didn't appreciate the attempt to undermine the positive atmosphere. Meanwhile, Mr. Chen was still engaged in conversation with Oliver. "You know, young man, I run an inventors club for gifted children. We meet every Saturday morning at the community center. Would you be interested in joining us?" Oliver's eyes widened. "Really? Mom, can I?" He turned to Lila, practically bouncing with excitement. Lila glanced at Margaret, who gave her an encouraging nod. "We'll talk about it, honey. It sounds wonderful." Margaret watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, though she could feel the sting of the whispered accusations around her. She'd learned enough about herself in recent months to know that the truth would speak louder than rumors. Mr. Chen turned to Margaret and Lila. "I had no idea Oliver was part of your mentorship program, Ms. Pierce. You're doing wonderful work here." He pulled out his business card. "I'd love to discuss getting more involved with the program. perhaps bringing some of my colleagues in as mentors." Before Margaret could respond, Oliver surprised everyone by speaking up. "Ms. Margaret didn't bring you here to help her business," he said loudly enough for nearby onlookers to hear. "She just wants to help kids like me who love inventing stuff. She's my friend." The simple honesty in Oliver's voice caused several of the whispering parents to look away in embarrassment. Lila reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand, both women fighting back tears as they watched Oliver continue his demonstration with unshakable enthusiasm. The whispers grew louder in the days following the science fair. Sandra Wheeler had turned her quiet criticism into a full-blown campaign against Margaret and the mentorship program. During morning drop-offs and afternoon pickups, she cornered other parents, her voice dripping with false concern. "I'm just saying we should be careful about letting big business use our children for PR stunts," she told anyone who would listen. "Did you know Pierce Industries just launched an education division? Quite convenient timing, don't you think?" The rumors spread like wildfire through the parent community. Within a week, 3 families had withdrawn their children from the mentorship program. 2 more followed the next day. Each withdrawal notice felt like a personal blow to Margaret, who had poured her heart into creating opportunities for children like Oliver. Margaret sat in her office staring at the latest withdrawal email when David knocked on her door. Her brother's face showed immediate concern when he saw her expression. "That bad, huh?" He pulled up a chair beside her desk. Margaret nodded, her voice thick with emotion. 5 families have pulled out. Mrs. Wheeler is telling everyone I'm using the program to boost company profits. She pushed away from her desk in frustration. "Maybe I should just step down, let someone else run it." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "Remember when we were kids, and Dad said you'd never make it in business because you were too sensitive?" He waited for Margaret's nod. "You proved him wrong by staying true to yourself. This is no different." "But the children," Margaret began. "Need someone who won't give up on them," David finished. "Real change always faces resistance, Maggie. Always." The next day, at the scheduled school board meeting, Margaret sat quietly as Sandra Wheeler took the podium. The PTA member's voice rang out across the gymnasium, full of manufactured concern. "We need to protect our children from being exploited," Sandra declared. "This so-called mentorship program is nothing more than a corporate publicity stunt designed to—" "That's enough." Margaret's voice cut through the murmurs as she stood up. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she walked to the front of the room. "Mrs. Wheeler, I've sat quietly while you spread rumors about me and this program, but not anymore." Margaret turned to face the crowd. "Yes, I run a successful company. Yes, I have resources. But do you know what I didn't have growing up? Someone who believed in me, who saw past the surface to recognize my potential." She pulled out Oliver's hand-drawn program logo from her folder. "This program isn't about publicity. It's about children like Oliver, who dream of becoming inventors, but might never get the chance without support. It's about breaking down the barriers that keep talented kids from reaching their full potential." Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "Mrs. Wheeler, you've questioned my motives at every turn, but while you've been spreading rumors, I've been watching children light up when they realize someone believes in them. That's what this program is about. Not PR, not profits, just pure possibility." The gymnasium fell silent. Sandra Wheeler stood frozen at the podium, her face flushed with embarrassment. Principal Roberts cleared his throat and stepped forward, but Margaret barely heard him. Her heart was pounding and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She had said what needed to be said, but the confrontation left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. David appeared at her side, gently guiding her back to her seat. "You did good, Maggie," he whispered. "You did real good." The morning after the confrontation at the school board meeting, Margaret received an unexpected call. Thomas Chen, the local inventor who had been impressed by Oliver's eco-friendly gadget at the science fair, wanted to meet with her and the school principal. "I've been following the developments with your mentorship program," Thomas said, his voice warm and enthusiastic over the speakerphone. "And I believe we can do something remarkable here." 2 days later, Margaret sat in Principal Roberts' office, watching Thomas Chen spread out detailed plans across the desk. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he explained his vision. What Oliver showed me wasn't just creativity, it was pure potential waiting to be nurtured, Thomas said, pointing to various documents. I want to sponsor the mentorship program and provide resources that will help all the children explore their interests in science and innovation. Principal Roberts leaned forward, his expression brightening. What kind of resources are we talking about, Mr. Chen? A fully equipped makerspace for starters, Thomas replied. 3D printers, basic robotics kits, educational software, everything these kids need to bring their ideas to life. And more importantly, I want to bring in other local inventors and entrepreneurs to work with the students. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. This is incredible, she managed to say. It's practical, Thomas corrected gently. These children are our future innovators. They just need the right tools and guidance to flourish. The news spread quickly through the school community. Parents who had withdrawn their children from the program began calling to re-enroll them. Even some of Sandra Wheeler's strongest supporters started questioning their stance. During afternoon pickup the following week, Margaret noticed a steady stream of parents approaching her. Their previous wariness had been replaced by genuine interest and support. My daughter hasn't stopped talking about the makerspace, one mother said warmly. Thank you for not giving up on this program. As the crowd of parents thinned, Lila approached Margaret. She was holding Oliver's hand, but her expression was different, softer, more open than Margaret had ever seen it. Could we talk for a moment? Lila asked quietly. They walked to a nearby bench while Oliver played with some friends on the playground. Lila sat silent for a moment, watching her son. You know, she finally said, when you first came into our lives, I was so sure you had some hidden agenda. I couldn't understand why someone like you would care about helping us. She turned to face Margaret. I was wrong. Margaret started to speak, but Lila held up her hand. Please, let me finish. I've watched you fight for this program, not just for Oliver, but for all the kids. You've faced criticism, rumors, and setbacks, but you never gave up. You've shown more genuine care and commitment than anyone I've ever met. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as Lila continued. The way Oliver's eyes light up when he talks about his inventions now, the confidence he has, that's because of you, Margaret. You didn't just give him resources, you gave him permission to dream big. Margaret wiped her eyes, watching Oliver show his friend something he'd drawn in his ever-present notebook. He did the same for me, she said softly. He showed me what really matters. Lila reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. Well, I guess we're both lucky he found you that day in the park. The community center buzzed with warmth and conversation as Margaret surveyed the decorated dining room. Round tables dotted with flickering candles filled the space, and a small podium stood at the front. Handmade thank you cards from students lined the walls, their colorful artwork bringing life to the normally plain room. Everything looks perfect, David said, appearing beside her. He adjusted one of the centerpieces, a miniature replica of Oliver's eco-friendly gadget that each table featured. You've really outdone yourself, sis. Margaret smoothed her dress nervously. I just want everyone to feel appreciated. Her voice softened. The way I should have appreciated you all these years? David's eyes grew misty. Maggie, he said, using her childhood nickname for the first time in decades. Watching you these past months, the way you've opened your heart to Oliver, to this community, I've gotten my sister back. She turned to him, her own eyes welling with tears. I'm so sorry, David. I was so focused on proving myself, on building walls, that I forgot what really matters. Family, he said simply, pulling her into a tight hug. And not just blood family, the family we choose. As they embraced, Oliver burst through the doors wearing a small suit that was slightly too big for him. His face lit up when he saw Margaret. Miss Margaret, Mom helped me practice my speech 10 times. Lila followed behind him, looking elegant in a modest blue dress. And he's still nervous, she said with a warm smile. You'll be wonderful, Margaret assured Oliver, kneeling to straighten his clip-on tie. Just speak from your heart, like you always do. As more guests arrived, teachers, volunteers, parents, and Thomas Chen himself, the room filled with the kind of genuine warmth Margaret had always found missing from her corporate events. People chatted across tables, sharing stories about their children's progress in the program. During the main course, Principal Roberts clinked his glass for attention. And now, we have a very special speaker, the young man whose creativity helped inspire this whole program. Oliver, would you like to come up? Oliver approached the podium, standing on a small step stool to reach the microphone. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded his paper. Before Miss Margaret came to our school, he began, his clear voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. I used to think that being an inventor was just a dream. Some kids made fun of me because my mom and I don't have lots of money. He paused, looking directly at Margaret. But Miss Margaret showed me that dreams don't care if you're rich or poor. They just care if you work hard and believe in yourself. Margaret felt Lila's hand slip into hers under the table as Oliver continued. Now we have a makerspace and lots of grown-ups who help us learn. But the best part isn't the cool stuff. It's that everybody helps each other. Miss Margaret taught us that being kind is just as important as being smart. By the time Oliver finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. As applause erupted, Lila turned to Margaret. I've been thinking, she said. This program needs someone who understands what these families are going through. Someone who can work alongside you, help make sure we're reaching everyone who needs it. She took a deep breath. I'd like to help manage the program with you. Margaret squeezed Lila's hand, feeling a profound sense of belonging wash over her. Here, surrounded by David, Oliver, Lila, and a community that had become her family, she finally felt at home. The news hit like a thunderbolt during their morning planning meeting. Principal Roberts' face was grim as he delivered it. The community center had suffered a burst pipe, making it unavailable for the mentorship program's launch event scheduled for next week. All the other suitable venues are booked, he explained, shuffling through a stack of papers. We've called everywhere. Margaret sat in silence, her mind racing. The launch event was crucial. They'd invited local media, business leaders, and potential donors. Canceling or postponing wasn't an option. She knew there was one solution, but she hesitated to voice it. David noticed her expression. Maggie, what are you thinking? Pierce Industries has a beautiful event space, she said slowly. It's twice the size of the community center, with state-of-the-art facilities. The room fell quiet. Margaret could practically hear the unspoken concerns. Using her company's space might feed right into the critics' accusations about her using the program for publicity. Lila leaned forward. Margaret, talk to us. What's really worrying you? Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. Remember all those rumors about this being a publicity stunt? If we hold it at Pierce Industries, won't it look like they were right? That this was all about corporate image? Stop right there, David said firmly. Anyone who's seen you with these kids knows better. Besides, what matters more? What a few skeptics might think, or making sure these children have their moment to shine. Oliver, who had been quietly drawing at a nearby table, looked up. Miss Margaret, can we really have it at your building? The one with the big fountain in front? His excitement was contagious and Margaret couldn't help but smile. Yes, that's the one. Cool. I can show everyone my new invention there. His eyes sparkled with anticipation. Lila reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. The children don't care about corporate politics or public perception. They care about having a space where they feel valued and supported. Principal Roberts nodded in agreement. It's a generous offer, Margaret, and frankly, it's our best option. Then it's settled, David announced, standing up. Let's make this happen. The next few days became a whirlwind of activity. Margaret worked with her company's events team, transforming the corporate space into something welcoming and child-friendly. Volunteers hung student artwork alongside the usual business portraits. The sterile conference rooms became showcase spaces for the children's projects. Lila took charge of reorganizing the presentation schedule, while David coordinated with caterers and technical staff. The entire community pitched in, proving that the program had grown beyond just Margaret's initiative. Standing in the lobby the day before the event, Margaret watched as Oliver helped arrange some of the younger children's science projects on display pedestals. His careful attention to making sure each project was perfectly visible touched her heart. Having second thoughts? Lila appeared beside her, clipboard in hand. Margaret shook her head. Actually, no, seeing the kids so excited about tomorrow, it puts everything in perspective. You've come a long way from that woman who was too busy on her phone to notice the world around her, Lila said softly. Thanks to a certain brave little boy, Margaret replied, watching Oliver demonstrate his invention to an impressed security guard. David joined them, looking pleased. The local news crew just confirmed they're coming. And guess what? 3 more schools have reached out about starting similar programs. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. Whatever critics might say, the impact on the children was real. Tomorrow, her corporate headquarters would be filled not with business suits and boardroom presentations, but with young dreamers and their supporters. And that, she realized, was exactly as it should be. The grand lobby of Pierce Industries buzzed with excitement as families, mentors, and community members filled the transformed space. Where corporate banners once hung, colorful student artwork now decorated the walls. The normally austere atmosphere had given way to the warm chatter of children and the proud murmurs of parents. Margaret stood near the back, her heart racing as she watched the scene unfold. Display tables showcased everything from simple science projects to complex mechanical designs. The local news crew moved through the crowd, capturing the enthusiasm that radiated from every corner. The turnout is incredible, David whispered, appearing beside his sister. Even the mayor showed up. Principal Roberts took the podium, his voice carrying across the packed lobby. Welcome to the official launch of our community mentorship program. What started as one person's vision has grown into something extraordinary. As various speakers shared their experiences, Margaret noticed Oliver fidgeting with his invention behind the stage. He wore his best clothes, a slightly too big dress shirt, and carefully pressed pants that Lila had saved for special occasions. His small hands kept adjusting and readjusting his project. When it was Oliver's turn to present, the room fell silent. He carried his invention to the front, a small device made from recycled materials that could help filter pond water. His voice, though nervous at first, grew stronger as he explained his creation. I got this idea when I first met Miss Margaret, he said, glancing at her with a smile. She was having a bad day near the park pond, and I thought maybe if the pond was cleaner, people could enjoy it more. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes as Oliver continued. But this isn't just about clean water, he said, his young face serious. It's about second chances. Miss Margaret gave me a chance to learn and grow. She showed me that sometimes people who seem scary at first just need someone to be kind to them. Sniffles could be heard throughout the audience. Margaret noticed several parents wiping their eyes. My mom always says that helping others makes us better too, Oliver continued. And she's right. This program helped me make my invention, but it also helped me make new friends. It helped Miss Margaret smile more. And it helped grown-ups learn that kids from different places can all do amazing things. The applause that followed was deafening. Oliver beamed as he demonstrated how his filter worked, answering questions from impressed audience members with confidence and enthusiasm. Margaret felt a gentle touch on her arm. It was Lila, her eyes glistening with tears. I was so wrong about you, Lila said softly. When you first came into our lives, I thought you were just another rich person trying to feel good about themselves. But you've changed everything, not just for Oliver, but for so many children. Margaret struggled to find words through her emotion. Your son changed me first, she managed. He showed me what I'd been missing by keeping everyone at arm's length. They watched together as Oliver continued explaining his invention to an impressed group of business leaders. His eyes sparkled with joy and pride, so different from the uncertain child who had been teased just months ago. David joined them, wrapping an arm around his sister's shoulders. Look at what you started, Maggie, he said proudly. All because you finally let someone in. The event continued around them, a testament to what could happen when barriers came down and communities came together. Children proudly showed off their projects, while mentors shared stories of transformation and growth. What had begun with a chance encounter in a park had blossomed into something far more meaningful than anyone could have imagined. The morning after the successful launch event, Margaret stood before her board of directors in the company's main conference room. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the concerned faces around the polished mahogany table. 20% of our annual profits, Margaret repeated firmly, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. That's what we'll be allocating to community education and mentorship programs. The announcement was met with immediate resistance. Board member James Harrison leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Ms. Pierce, while we appreciate your charitable interests, this is a publicly traded company. Our responsibility is to our shareholders. With all due respect, another director added, this seems like an emotional decision rather than a business one. Margaret took a deep breath, thinking of Oliver's bright eyes as he presented his invention. Let me tell you a story, she began, moving away from her usual position at the head of the table to stand near the windows. 6 months ago, I was exactly who you wanted me to be, focused solely on profit margins and market expansion, and I was utterly alone. The board members shifted uncomfortably as Margaret continued. Then a 6-year-old boy saved my life, not just by calling for help when I collapsed, but by showing me what really matters. Through him and his mother, I've seen firsthand how many brilliant minds we're wasting simply because they lack resources and opportunities. David, who sat among the board members, nodded encouragingly. Margaret drew strength from his support. This isn't just charity, she continued, her voice growing passionate. This is an investment in our future workforce, in innovation, in the communities that support our business. The mentorship program we launched yesterday, it's already identified dozens of promising young minds who could revolutionize their fields if given the chance. She pulled up slides showing the success metrics from the program's launch. Look at these numbers. Look at the potential we're unlocking. Every child like Oliver who gets support today could be developing the next breakthrough technology tomorrow. The CFO raised his hand. But 20%? That's unprecedented. So is the return we'll see, Margaret countered. Not just in goodwill and PR, but in real, measurable impact. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you this is the direction we're taking, because I've learned that true success isn't measured quarterly, it's measured in generations. Later that afternoon, Lila arrived at Margaret's office, having heard about the announcement. She found Margaret staring out her window, lost in thought. The board members think I've lost my mind, Margaret said without turning around. No, Lila replied softly. I think you've finally found your heart. Margaret turned, surprised by Lila's presence. When I first met you and Oliver, I thought I was the one who had something to give, but you've given me so much more. You showed me what it means to be part of something bigger than myself. Lila moved closer, her eyes glistening. When you first came into our lives, I was so suspicious. I thought you were just another wealthy person trying to feel good about yourself. But watching you fight for these children, putting your own reputation and profits on the line. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. You're not the same person who collapsed in that park. No, Margaret agreed, thinking of the long journey from that day to this moment. I'm not, and I never want to be that person again. Through her office window, they could see children playing in the community park across the street. Their laughter floated up, a reminder of why this decision, despite its challenges, felt so right. Inspired by her recent transformation, Margaret sat in her home office one evening, staring at an old family photo album. The leather-bound book felt heavy in her hands, filled with memories of happier times before ambition had consumed her life. Pictures of family picnics, holiday gatherings, and birthday celebrations showed a younger, smiling Margaret surrounded by loving relatives. With trembling fingers, she picked up her phone and dialed David's number. I want to reach out to everyone, she said when he answered. All of them. Aunt Sarah, Uncle Pete, Cousin Rachel, even Jenny from college. I need to make things right. David's voice softened. Are you sure you're ready for this? No, Margaret admitted, her voice catching. But I need to do it anyway. Over the next week, Margaret and David worked together to organize a gathering at her house. Each invitation she sent felt like both a confession and a plea. Some responses came quickly, polite but distant acceptances. Others took days, leaving Margaret anxious and uncertain. On the day of the reunion, Margaret paced her living room, adjusting flowers and rearranging appetizer plates. David arrived early to provide moral support, bringing homemade cookies their grandmother used to make. "They're not exactly like hers," he said, placing them on the coffee table, "but I thought it might help everyone remember the good times." The first arrival was Aunt Sarah, her silver hair now streaked with white, her eyes carrying the same warmth Margaret remembered from childhood. "Margaret," she said simply, standing in the doorway. "Aunt Sarah," Margaret replied, her practiced speech forgotten. "I've missed you so much." The words came out in a rush, and before she knew it, she was wrapped in her aunt's embrace, tears threatening to fall. Others arrived gradually. Uncle Pete with his distinctive laugh, Cousin Rachel with her teenage daughters whom Margaret had never met, old college friends who had once been as close as sisters. The initial awkwardness hung heavy in the air, but David's gentle conversation and the familiar smell of grandmother's cookies helped ease the tension. When everyone had arrived, Margaret stood in the center of her living room, hands clasped tightly together. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know I don't deserve your time or attention after how I've behaved over the years." She looked at each face in turn, seeing the hurt she had caused reflected in their eyes. "I convinced myself that success meant more than family, that building my company was worth missing weddings, birthdays, and Sunday dinners. I was wrong. So terribly wrong." Rachel shifted in her seat, her daughters watching curiously. Margaret continued, "It took a little boy's kindness to show me what I'd become, and what I'd lost. I can't change the past, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to be part of your lives again." The silence that followed felt endless until Uncle Pete cleared his throat. "Well," he said gruffly, "your grandmother always said family is family, no matter what." He stood up and walked over to Margaret, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "Welcome back, kiddo." One by one, family members shared their hurt, their disappointment, but also their hope. Jenny, her college roommate, spoke about feeling abandoned when Margaret missed her father's funeral. Aunt Sarah described years of trying to reach out, only to be met with brief, distracted responses. Margaret listened to each story, accepting their pain without excuses. As the afternoon wore on, old stories began to surface, memories of shared adventures and family traditions. David watched his sister with pride as she remained present and engaged, so different from the woman who had once checked her phone during their mother's birthday dinner. Margaret sat at her dining room table surrounded by papers, sketches, and a crude prototype of Oliver's invention. The 6-year-old boy excitedly explained his idea while Lila took careful notes, her proud smile impossible to hide. "So when you turn this part," Oliver demonstrated, twisting a small handle on his device, "it collects rainwater and filters it for plants." His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as he showed how the simple mechanism worked. Margaret leaned forward, studying the contraption with genuine interest. "This is brilliant, Oliver. And you're saying it's made entirely from recycled materials?" "Uh-huh," Oliver nodded vigorously. "Mom helped me collect old bottles and stuff from the recycling center." Lila reached over to smooth Oliver's unruly hair. "He's been working on this design for weeks. Every night before bed, he adds something new to his drawings." The local Young Inventors competition was just days away, and they had gathered to help Oliver prepare his presentation. Margaret watched as Lila gently guided Oliver through his explanation again, marveling at how far they'd all come. Just months ago, Lila would have been suspicious of Margaret's involvement, but now they worked together seamlessly, each contributing their strengths to support Oliver's dream. "Remember," Margaret advised, "when you present to the judges, start with why you created this. Tell them about the plants in your school garden that weren't getting enough water." Oliver practiced his presentation, occasionally stumbling over words but never losing his enthusiasm. When he mentioned how the device could help schools save money on water bills, Margaret and Lila exchanged impressed glances. The preliminary rounds of the competition arrived quickly. Oliver stood before the first panel of judges, his invention displayed on a small table. Though his voice shook slightly, he remembered everything they had practiced. Margaret and Lila watched from the audience, holding hands unconsciously as they silently cheered him on. "The judges look interested," Lila whispered to Margaret as one of them leaned forward to examine the device more closely. "Of course they are," Margaret replied softly. "It's practical, sustainable, and created by a 6-year-old genius." When Oliver advanced to the final round, his excitement was contagious. The night before the big presentation, they gathered at Lila's house for one last practice session. Oliver's nervous energy had him bouncing off the walls. "What if I forget everything?" he suddenly asked, his earlier confidence wavering. Lila pulled him into a warm hug. "You won't forget, sweetheart. You know this invention inside and out because it came from your heart." Margaret nodded in agreement. "And we'll be right there in the audience supporting you all the way." The final presentation day arrived and the auditorium buzzed with excitement. Oliver stood backstage, clutching his invention and taking deep breaths. Margaret and Lila gave him encouraging smiles as they took their seats in the front row. When Oliver's name was called, he walked onto the stage with determined steps. His voice started soft but grew stronger as he explained his invention's purpose and demonstrated its use. The judges watched intently, nodding and taking notes. "I made this because every drop of water matters," Oliver concluded, his young voice clear and confident. "And if we help nature, nature helps us back." The audience broke into enthusiastic applause, with Margaret and Lila leading the standing ovation. Tears glistened in both women's eyes as they watched Oliver beam with pride, standing tall beside his invention. The evening after the competition, Oliver sat at his small desk in his bedroom, carefully writing on a piece of lined paper. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration as he formed each letter with deliberate care. Several crumpled attempts lay scattered around his feet, evidence of his determination to get the words just right. "Dear Miss Margaret," he wrote, pausing occasionally to sound out the more challenging words. "Thank you for believing in me and helping me with my inventions. Before I met you, some kids at school said I couldn't be an inventor because we didn't have enough money, but you showed me that dreams don't care if you're rich or poor." He paused, chewing thoughtfully on his pencil before continuing. "You're like my guardian angel, except you wear fancy suits instead of wings. Mom says that sometimes angels come in different ways, and I think she's right." Oliver's small hands gripped the pencil tighter as he poured his heart onto the paper. "I love how you listen to all my ideas, even the silly ones, and how you never laugh at me when I mess up words. You make me feel brave and smart." Tears welled up in his eyes as he wrote the next part. "Sometimes I wish you were my aunt or something because you feel like family now. Mom smiles more since you came into our lives, and that makes me happy too." He carefully folded the letter and placed it in an envelope that Lila had given him. With painstaking attention, he wrote, "Miss Margaret Pierce" on the front, adding a small heart next to her name. The next morning, Oliver asked his mother to drive him to Margaret's office. He clutched the envelope tightly in his small hands as they rode the elevator to her floor. When Margaret's secretary saw them, she immediately ushered them into the office with a warm smile. Margaret looked up from her desk, her face brightening at the sight of Oliver. "What a wonderful surprise," she exclaimed, rising to greet them. Oliver shuffled forward, suddenly shy. "I made something for you," he said quietly, holding out the envelope with both hands. Margaret accepted it carefully, noting the slight tremor in Oliver's hands. She opened the envelope and unfolded the letter, her eyes moving across the carefully printed words. As she read, tears began to well up in her eyes. Her hand moved to cover her mouth, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Each heartfelt word from Oliver struck a chord deep within her. "Oh, Oliver," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt down to his level, holding the letter close to her heart. "This is the most precious gift I've ever received." Oliver's face lit up with relief and joy. "Really? Even more than your fancy car?" Margaret laughed through her tears, pulling him into a tight hug. "More than anything in the world," she assured him, "because this comes from your heart." Later that evening, after Oliver and Lila had left, Margaret carefully placed the letter in an elegant silver frame she'd had on her shelf. She positioned it prominently on her desk, where she could see it every day. Her fingers traced the glass covering Oliver's words, especially the part where he called her his guardian angel. The letter would serve as a daily reminder of how far she'd come from the cold, isolated person she used to be. It represented not just Oliver's gratitude, but her own transformation, from a woman who measured success in dollars to one who measured it in moments of connection and love. Margaret sat at her desk, looking at the framed letter, feeling a profound sense of peace and purpose. Oliver's simple, honest words had captured everything she hoped to be, everything she was striving to become. This wasn't just a thank you note. It was a testament to the power of opening one's heart to love and possibility. The mentorship program's success spread like wildfire through the community. One by one, neighboring schools reached out to Margaret and Lila, eager to implement similar programs for their students. Margaret found herself spending more time in school hallways than boardrooms these days, and she couldn't have been happier about it. "We've got 3 more schools interested in joining the program," Lila announced one morning, shuffling through papers at their shared desk in the community center. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she handed Margaret the requests. Margaret smiled, remembering how far they'd come from their first tense meetings. Now, they worked side by side, their different perspectives creating a perfect balance. "Your organizational skills are exactly what we needed to make this work," she told Lila warmly. Meanwhile, Oliver bounced between the different schools, sharing his enthusiasm for invention with other children. His confidence had grown tremendously, and he took pride in showing younger students how to believe in themselves. Margaret's transformation caught the attention of other wealthy individuals in the community. Several approached her after seeing the program's impact, curious about how they could make a difference too. "It's not just about writing checks," Margaret explained to a group of business leaders during a mentoring session. "It's about showing up, being present, and really understanding what the community needs." Lila had become an expert at managing the day-to-day operations, coordinating volunteers, and ensuring each school received proper support. Her natural ability to connect with parents and teachers helped the program maintain its personal touch despite its growth. One afternoon, as Margaret and Lila reviewed plans for the newest school edition, Oliver burst into their office, his face flushed with excitement. "I've been thinking," he announced, pulling up a chair between them. "When I grow up, I want to run the program just like you two do." Margaret and Lila exchanged touched glances. "Really?" Margaret asked, her heart swelling with pride. Oliver nodded enthusiastically. "I can help kids believe in their dreams just like you helped me believe in mine. Plus," he added with a grin, "I'll already know how everything works because I've been watching you both." Lila reached over and squeezed her son's hand. "You already help so many kids believe in themselves, sweetheart." The program continued to flourish under their guidance. Margaret found herself regularly meeting with business leaders who wanted to learn from her experience. She shared her journey openly, emphasizing how one small act of kindness from a child had changed her entire perspective on success and purpose. The second family day at Oliver's school felt worlds apart from Margaret's first visit. Instead of whispers about her designer clothes, she was greeted with warm smiles and enthusiastic waves from parents and teachers alike. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as families filed in, finding their seats among the rows of folding chairs. Margaret sat between Lila and David, her heart full as she watched Oliver prepare for his presentation. He stood near the stage, clutching his note cards, wearing the bow tie she had given him for the special occasion. When Oliver's turn came, he walked confidently to the podium, his invention displayed proudly beside him. "Today, I want to talk about my journey as an inventor," he began, his clear voice carrying across the quiet room. "But more importantly, I want to talk about the 2 amazing women who made it possible." Margaret felt tears welling up as Oliver continued. "My mom has always believed in me, even when things were tough. She worked so hard to give me everything I need." Lila squeezed Margaret's hand, both women trying to hold back their emotions. "And then there's Margaret," Oliver said, beaming in her direction. "She came into our lives by accident. Well, actually because she fainted and I helped her." The audience chuckled. "But she stayed because she cared. She showed me that dreams can come true if you have people who believe in you." As Oliver demonstrated his eco-friendly invention, Margaret's mind drifted back to that day in the park. She had been so different then, cold, isolated, focused only on success. Now, sitting here surrounded by community and love, she barely recognized that person. After the presentations, as families mingled over cookies and punch, Margaret turned to Lila. "I need to thank you both," she said softly. "You and Oliver taught me what really matters in life. You showed me that true success isn't about what you have, but about who you share it with." Lila smiled, her eyes glistening. "You taught us something too, Margaret. You showed us that sometimes letting someone in, even when it's scary, can bring the most beautiful changes." Oliver bounded over to them, his face glowing with excitement. "Did you see everyone's faces when I showed how my invention works?" he asked, practically bouncing. The three of them found a quiet corner of the gymnasium, away from the crowd. Oliver sat between them, chattering happily about his presentation, while Margaret and Lila exchanged knowing looks over his head. Their laughter mingled together, creating a melody of joy that echoed through the space. "So," Oliver said, looking up at them both, "what's our next adventure going to be?" Margaret and Lila shared a warm smile, both understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together, their unconventional but perfectly matched family. If you enjoyed the story of Margaret, Oliver, and Lila, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.